IED in place, sir.
Fire coming from this fire. Come around, pick up our trail. We take a fire from 4 different places. That was quite a bit of fire there.
Wall of death heading east, going low level.
Hey, welcome everyone to the Low Level Hell Podcast, episode 7. I'm your host, Brian. I'm joined today by my buddy, Luke Whittington. How you doing, Luke?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, back on, because actually you were in episode 4, if I'm not mistaken, though at the time you didn't know you were going to be on episode 4.
Not a problem at all. Glad to be a reappearance.
Yeah, we're just kind of using old stock footage there, but I thought that was a good conversation about flight school and everything, and it didn't seem worthwhile to kind of rehash what we had already talked about. It'd probably come off a little fake. So, but yeah, so we're going to close out kind of this series, if you will, on training. So we did the Navy, of course, and which really kind of covers the Marines and the Coast Guard. So really all we have left is the dirty Air Force, which we have our friend Sean Gavin from the New York Air National Guard. He's going to talk to us about Air Force Flight School. But first, we did have some listener questions, and Luke, I was hoping you could help me out with this one. So this comes from, he signs off as Paul, CW4 retired. But I'm gathering from his question and some of the comments that he has been retired for quite a while. So thank you for your service there, Paul. And it says here that I heard the Army released a lot of OH-58 Delta pilots when they closed out the program. So he's talking about divestiture of the OH-58 back in, what was that, 2015, 16?
Yep, 2015.
Okay, 2015. He says, is that true? And if so, about what percentage did they let go? So that's a pretty complicated question because, of course, as Paul knows and as you and I know, the Army has warrant officers and commissioned officers. So it's going to be kind of a different population. So I know I'm putting you on the spot there, Luke, but you don't have any idea of roughly percentage regarding warrant officers that were cut basically after the 58 was cut?
So not exact numbers that HRC would have by any stretch, sure. But the initial selection to get H-64 transitions was somewhere in that 20 to 22% range. There was a extremely low percentage that got other aircraft transitions. And of course, they did that review board to see who was, who the cream of the crop was, which was an interesting process too, because it was not a formal board. So it kind of dodged in and out of some legal things there, but that's what they had to do to make it happen. But I think around 30% actually got to stay in some capacity. So it was probably close to, it might be a little higher if you count the guys that went to UAS, which was a fair number of them. They really bolstered up the warrant officer population for the UAS branch.
Sure.
But it was a high kick to the curb rate.
Well, because at that point, we didn't have much of a UAS infrastructure when it came to personnel and certainly not warrant officers. So it was kind of a good timing in regards to you had bodies to put into places. And so I know I've met quite a few 58 guys who were now UAS. But yeah, and that's kind of the trouble on the warrant officer side is, once your aircraft goes away in the Army, if you're not flying something, the Army's probably struggling to figure out what to do with you, in mass. It's got the onesies and twosies you can kind of put here and there. But for the warrant officers, that sounds about the numbers that I remember here, and around 30-40% that actually got to kind of stay. I mean, and then the rest were just kind of let go.
There were several that decided to just leave because they knew they weren't going to get a transition. There were several that there was actually a really high rate of people that rejected the transition, turned it down because they did not want to fly Apaches.
Yeah, or
that,
anything else.
Right, and that was kind of an interesting. I don't know. There's a couple different things you can pull from that. Number one, obviously, our community loved our mission and what our role was on the battlefield. We're all very passionate about it. I think very cohesive for an airframe population. I think that was pretty unique. So that was one part. The other one is personal opinion, but I think that they made some decisions that I wouldn't have wanted to have to make. Number one, to have to cut people. But number two, I think they made it on a lot of assumptions that everybody grew up dying to be an Apache pilot. And that turned out not to be the case,
Yeah, it's not true. Well, I think there's some practicality to it as well. So if you're sitting at, 15, 16 years in service, you may want to hang in there, of course, to hit your 20. But if you're at 10 years, now you're looking at, changing airframes. I don't remember what the ADSO that came with that. So you're kind of at that hump where, well, now it's time to, maybe the Army's kind of made a decision for me. I can go do something different. So
yeah,
everyone had a different situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It was 2-year concurrent ADSO, which is a pretty good deal for picking up another aircraft qualification. It moved a lot of guys from single engine to multi-engine. Then if they got E-models out of it, then they're also doing multi-engine IFR, which is that's a benefit right there too when you get out. So, not all bad. Definitely some trade-offs. Like I said, I would not have wanted to have been in the hot seat to make those decisions. Talk to the guys that did have to make those decisions, and I get what they did and why they had to do it, and it was just unfortunate. So.
Yeah, and it kind of came out of nowhere, I think, for a lot of people. And then on the commission side of the house, it's a little bit different because, as I alluded to with the warrant officers, it's kind of their bread and butter. But for the commission side, there's plenty of other jobs in the military that they can find for you. And, I was one of the lucky ones that did get a transition, but I remember being in a squadron XO position, and some of my XOs to left and right did not get an aircraft transition, but they were still in a line unit doing that job where they would have been flying had they gotten a transition. And the Army can find plenty of jobs for people like that, and kind of, you can ride out the rest of your career never touching another aircraft. And I think some people are happy to do that, but for the most part, it was not a good time for others. But yeah, I guess to make a short answer long there, Paul, it absolutely did happen, and it happens across the board. Of around the same time that the divestiture was happening, I went to a course somewhere in DC. It was like a couple days, and I was in there with an Air Force pilot, and he was a Osprey pilot, and he had been a MH-53 guy before that. And he was kind of describing the same thing that happened in the Air Force, where he was an MH-53 guy, and he kind of saw the writing on the wall early and managed to squeeze in a transition. And he said a lot of his buddies were like, well, the Air Force is going to take care of me when it's time. They'll just transfer me over. And, the music stopped and not everyone had a chair to sit in. So it's not a Army thing. It's a military thing. And, there was a lot of this talk when that was happening of like, okay, yeah, but you're cutting, so many 58 guys, but you're not cutting any Apache guys, and the idea being that, well, there's probably one or two Apache guys who are not as good, whatever standard you're going to use as good or bad, but not as good as these Kiowa guys that you're going to get rid of. And while that's true, how do you manage that? There's money associated, right? I mean, just because.
So there's a couple interesting things there, because I was in the first batch, like I was in the first transition class that was all 58D guys. Okay, which is kind of funny in itself. But in that same time period, basically I found out that I got selected for W4, and 2 weeks later got an email that was my reservation for the course. I was like, no, what's this all about? They're like, oh, you're going. I was like, well, I just finished all this Lakota training, and I had just finished the Lakota instructor pilot transition course, which I was in the first class of that to get the whole transition to Lakotas up for flight school. So I kind of went from one course to another, which was interesting. But of that year group, or my promotion year group, there were less than 10 of us picked up for W4, if I remember correctly. And so it was like far below 30% of the available people to make W4 for 58Ds. It was a really, really low pickup.
Yeah.
And for 64s, it was like 120%. There was a guy at Tickham who had been medically grounded and cell-conned that made it from 3 to 4, allegedly. So, it was kind of interesting because basically they were promoting dead W3s if you were Apache qualified.
Right.
But then they were cutting mass amounts of senior W3s in the 58 community. And the other thing that's interesting, not to belabor this for too long and take up the whole time, but this was just kind of a big event that happened and unfolded. The UH-60 population consistently ran above 110%. None of them got cut.
Yeah.
How's that work? There wasn't a shortage. So you're telling me they couldn't have done a review board and cut from the bottom rather than get rid of a bunch of guys that were really invested in? Don't get me wrong, we had our special children too, but there could have been a little different approach that I think would have been more equitable than promoting the dead, not trimming the fat, and just kicking a whole bunch of highly skilled dudes to the street and dudettes.
Yeah, it's certainly fuzzy math, and I don't envy anyone who had to kind of work that out and figure out the right answer, because there probably is no right answer, but it did seem a little chaotic at the time. But it is what it is.
Yeah, and we talked about the ripple effect then as well, because they knew that they were going to have to cut X amount. Well, at the same time, they're going to get rid of the aircraft, so for that period of time, there would be no aircraft to fly for any of those people. And a lot of people went into that where they were going to get a transition, but they had to wait 2+ years or whatever. So we told them, we said, you should don't cut them. Why don't you, bring them to Rucker, train them as instructor pilots, staff kind of regreen the force out here, especially on like the tactical training side. You could get more throughput and everything else. Well, they knew they had a white book projected, like a forecasted decline in the white book already. So there was really nothing for them to do. And so we said, well, if you do that, then when you get all these new 64 airframes fielding the Echo, you're going to be short 2 to 3 squadrons or battalion size elements. Lo and behold, 3 years later, that's where they were. And then they got back to bonus and everything else. So anyway, that horse is dead.
Yeah,
I won't kick it anymore.
Troubling
That's probably more
kind
than
of frame it that way.
Yeah.
But it's also important to understand that the way the budget works, you can only do so much because the budget is a year to year, right? And so, I imagine there's some ripple effect with personnel and manning, with regards to that as well. So, but yeah.
So another fun 58D fact, did you know that the last year that the OH-58D was a line item on the budget was 2006?
Oh, wow. No, I did not know that.
So United 3 deployments in an aircraft that was not even officially a line item number in the budget.
That explains why I couldn't get new seat cushions.
Yep, well, that's part of it. Well, they built the Fox Model 58 out of unspent EM funds from the other aircraft. Think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, moving money around.
Yeah,
I do remember all the new stuff that when they cut the Comanche, brand new building for the Apache guys to learn stuff in. So.
Brand new Fox Model 47. So, but anyway, all that really centers around the training availability and the training potential to actually have a ready force of qualified pilots.
Yeah. Yeah, and it takes a while. Well, we can go into it, but it takes a while to train a guy in Apache, even though I think that they probably could have relooked the training pipeline for 58 guys, because by the end of the 4th month, I was just tired. I didn't want to do it anymore. It just seemed to be at kind of a snail's pace. But it's neither here nor there. Okay, well, yeah. So I think we've definitely answered Paul's question. Hopefully, if not, send us another note, and we'll try to expand it a little bit further. But flight school, we're going to finish up this series, and I know you've had a chance to listen to it. Any thoughts before we roll into it?
No, I would. Well, I mean, I say no, but then I'm going to start talking again. I do apologize, but I thought it was great hearing his journey, and I think the listeners will enjoy it too. And it really piqued my interest because as we looked at revamping training, we brought the Lakota on. We were looking at adopting some of the Air Force training strategies. So,
okay, all right. Well, with that said, we'll go ahead and roll into the interview, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey, everybody. I'm here with Major Sean Gavin from the New York Air National Guard. How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing well, Brian. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we could make this happen. We've been talking now for a while. So the focus today, like we talked about, is kind of going through the different flight schools and really for the listeners to get an understanding and appreciation of the training that happens in the different services. And of course, being a good Army guy, I left the Air Force for last, but
naturally.
Yeah, no, it's just the way it turned out. But we've been talking a little bit, and just kind of wanted to go through your experiences and share what it's like going through the Air Force flight school. But first, just tell us a little bit about you. You know, where you're from and how you got to there to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Hudson Valley of New York, not too far from West Point actually, and never moved from there until college. Went down to college at Florida Institute of Technology down in Melbourne, Florida, and at that point, I only kind of knew about, well, there's the service academies and then there's ROTC as ways to kind of become a military pilot, which I always wanted to become. I just wasn't sure who I wanted to fly for or really what I wanted to fly. Um, Florida Tech had an aviation program, but the only ROTC program they had was Army. So I opted for that because I was like, oh, hey, cool, I can fly, naturally, like kind of like we were talking about before, Apaches or something that shoots
Mm,
things and blow things up.
right.
Um, so I did that for about a year. I talked to some Army aviators, and they were like, if you want to fly for your entire career, you should probably go warrant or you should go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Um, so,
Sure.
so I kind of looked at that, and the Army ROTC battalion down there was awesome. But I was like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And kind of started looking at some other options, um, and eventually found out about how I could get in through the Air National Guard through pilot training there, which is its own animal that we can talk about here in a bit. But got selected for them eventually through New York Air National Guard, 101st Rescue Squadron, and went to pilot training. Started in 2008 after I got commissioned in '07 through essentially the Guard Officer Candidate School, and was in the pipeline for about 2 years, and I've been back at the 101st since July 2010.
Okay. All right. So yeah, to your point of who flies most when, and I agree with the advice that you were given as an Army commissioned officer. Flying is definitely not your primary, but I think too. I'm sure you can acknowledge that there's probably jobs that, in the Air Force, and certainly talking to my last guest in the Navy, the flying sometimes does take a backseat
Oh,
to certain
absolutely.
jobs,
Yeah,
and,
it's
and
not
I think
unique.
it's important. Yeah, and I think it's important that people understand that when they look at these careers, because I talk to a lot of young guys who want to fly, and it's always trying to get them to understand, like, hey, I got it, I want to fly too, but
Right.
there's certain things that need to be done, and only you can do them, and yeah, it just kind of depends, and sometimes you're lucky, and sometimes you do get to fly predominantly, and then sometimes not so lucky. But okay, so and I guess there's probably some differences too for your track. Certainly, the same for us when we talk about the guard and reserve is, it sounds like you were already sort of selected. You were already accepted into a unit and knew you were going to fly whatever that unit flew. Is that fair assessment?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate.
Okay.
So I kind of found out about the guard route. I believe it was sophomore year of college. One of our alumni actually flew down an HC-130, which is the rescue version of a C-130,
Hmm.
and was talking to him. I was kind of like, man, this seems kind of cool, but we don't have ROTC, and obviously I'm not in the academy. It's like, what do you mean? So I found out that individual Air National Guard units will actually go ahead and they'll project different pilot vacancies based on retirements or separations, down the road, how many people they
Right.
need to keep the manning up, and they'll hold basically pilot training boards for people who aren't rated Air Force pilots yet. They obviously take people from active duty and other Guard units if they're interested,
Sure.
and all that. But it's essentially kind of like a cross between applying for a job and kind of rushing for like a fraternity.
Yeah.
Uh, there's different exams you need to take. Um, Air Force officer qualifying test is kind of like the Air Force SAT for officers. You put a resume together, any sort of flight hours, letters of recommendation. It varies by unit, but you can try and find out either from their website or from the recruiter. And so you put this whole application package together, you submit it, and then they'll go ahead, look through those, and select who they want to interview. And then from the interviews, they'll select based on how many people they need. Usually primary and alternate candidates to be selected for flight training. So that's it was about a year's worth of interviewing. I interviewed at New York twice, and then I interviewed at Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maryland, I believe, which all had different types of aircraft. To kind of get myself a pilot slot.
Yeah. Yeah, I always kind of tell people. I started my career in the Guard. I was in the South Carolina Guard for about
Okay.
2.5 years as a ground guy, as an armor guy,
Sure.
and I went to an early commissioning program. So when I commissioned, I was 19 years old, and I came out as a branched armor guy, a tank guy, but I could have gone anywhere because it wasn't really solidified in the sense that I hadn't been to school. But I did the same thing. I kind of shopped around and found a unit that needed a tank platoon leader, and same kind of deal. I kind of went in
Sure.
and interviewed, and they called me later and says, "Yeah, okay, how do you feel about being a tank platoon leader?" I was like, that sounds great. So yeah, so the Guard is kind of this sort of club mentality. Like you said, you're interviewing for a job. And I remember my stick buddy in flight school, he was a California National Guard guy, and yeah, I mean, he showed up knowing I'm going to fly Blackhawks.
Right.
Whereas, all of us active guys were like, "Oh, I don't know what I'm going to end up flying."
Yep.
You're nervous and worried about it. And these guys, really nothing to worry about other than just passing. But
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So talk us through it. So you get selected, you're going to fly something, or, at least assuming that you pass everything, but you've been selected to go to flight training. What's the next step?
Yeah, so the next step is if you're not commissioned already, they'll send you, obviously you have to get commissioned. So it's basically officer candidate school. It used to be a little bit shorter, but now I think it's 12 or 13 weeks, and now it's down in Montgomery, Alabama, Maxwell Air Force Base. So then after that, it's kind of changed a little bit over the years. I didn't have to go to what was called initial flight screening out in Pueblo, Colorado. I know they still send some people there. The vast majority of active duty people go, but because of my prior flight experience, having at least a private pilot license back then, I didn't have to go out there and do that, and that was basically flying small general aviation aircraft, but kind of in an Air Force pilot training environment. But anyway, once you get to the actual pilot training pipeline itself, at the moment the way it works is everyone goes through the same first two phases together. And that's at a few different bases. So you could go to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi, Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas, which is mainly fighter bomber guys, but not all the time. And then there's Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas, which is where I ended up. So phase one is pretty much all academics. It's all ground-based academics. You have some simulators to work over your ground procedures, so on and so forth. That's about 6 weeks. It's known as slackademics because you don't know how much free time you have until you hit the flight line, which is phase two. Phase two is in the T6 Texan 2. It's a single-engine turboprop with one guy in the front, one guy in the back. It was an awesome airplane to fly, except for the guy in the back telling you everything you were doing was wrong all the time. Yeah. Which, probably none of my former instructors are listening to this, but I love you guys. So there's a few different phases they put you through there. And again, all this it's kind of in flux right now. They're looking at integrating some virtual reality, modifying the syllabus. But when I went through, there was a contact phase, which is all visual maneuvers. And it started out with very basic stuff, traffic pattern stalls, learning how to basically fly the aircraft and not get yourself in a dangerous situation, or if you were in one, how to get yourself out. And then that went into advanced aerobatics. Then you went to instrument phase and then formation phase at the end. That was about 5 or 6 months worth. Just under 90 hours is what I logged in the T6 itself. Not simulators or anything like that, just purely the aircraft. Which you can make an argument for. Yeah, it's good for everyone to go through all that stuff, or maybe I should tailor it back if someone knows they're going to a certain aircraft. But I appreciated it. I learned a lot, even being a prior civilian fixed wing guy. I learned a ton. And really the networking opportunities and the opportunity to learn how to fixed wing guys operate in a majority fixed wing force was really, really helpful to me. And then
end of the day, I mean, that's probably what you're still gaining from it. Like you said, you've already got a pilot's license and you already know you're gonna fly helicopters, but you're making friends and learning how the big Air Force works.
Yeah, and to be honest, like I said, the airplane itself, I thought was a hell of a lot of fun. It's a great plane. Yeah. So at the end of phase two, or just prior to it, they pass around pretty much a dream sheet, as they call it, for everyone who doesn't already know where they're going, who's in Guard or Reserve. And so there's a few different tracks you can choose. They've they've bumped it down to 3 now. It used to be 4 when I was in there. But so there's the fighter bomber track, which will send you to the T-38 training aircraft. There's the tanker transport, which sends you to the T-1, which is kind of like a twin engine, looks like a small business jet, like a Beechcraft jet. And then there's rotary wing, which sends you to Fort Rucker to fly now entirely the TH-1. It's an upgraded UE, single engine UE.
Right.
So there's not a lot of helicopter pilots in the Air Force in general. And everyone thought, oh man, you're going to Fort Rucker, you're going to train with the Army, you're going to be intense. And I'm like, no, man.
That's right. Every Army base as well as this
yeah, exactly. No, man. One, that's not the case, and two, it's Air Force aircraft, Air Force instructors, Air Force squadron. We just happen to be on an Army base.
I was gonna say I never interacted with any Air Force guys anytime I went to Rucker.
Yeah,
you knew they were there, but
we're
you
a
didn't
small community, man. It's
yeah. I don't even know where you guys did anything. Like, did you guys fly out of Cairns or where were they?
Oh gosh, I was. They were flying out of Cairns when I was there. Prior to that, they had been at Low, for a bit.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, it kind of
where dirty lift guys hang out. So that's probably why I never saw them. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, you never really cross paths unless you're PX, I guess.
Yeah. So phase 3 for Air Force helicopter, and additionally some tilt rotor guys, the aircraft that can't decide whether it's a helicopter or an airplane.
Right.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. Abomination.
It's exactly. It's at Fort Rucker. It's all in the TH-1 upgraded UE, and I had 112 hours there, and that was right around just over 5 months of training down at Fort Rucker. And again, you had different phases. You had your basic, kind of contact, visual maneuvers phase, try not to kill yourself, and learn how to get out of bad situations. Remote phase, which is all about, hey, here's something that's off of an airport you can land to, instruments, and then day tactical, and then you moved into night phase. So you actually flew night vision goggles before you were winged at Fort Rucker, which is pretty cool. And then at the end of phase 3, you're rated. You graduate, you get your wings. And just like prior to end of phase 2, at the end of phase 3 in Fort Rucker, they pass around a dream sheet if you don't know where you're going. And kind of the options are, okay, do you want to go to 60s? Do you want to go to Hueys, or it'll be the 139 soon? Or do you want to go to CVs? And, different bases that they have available. And everyone's ranked, and you get what you get.
So going back, just kind of the start. So you got to basically clip out of the first phase because you already had a pilot's license.
Well, that was just what was it? Introductory flight screening. Yeah, I still went through phase 1 academics. Yeah,
sure. Okay, my wrong term, but
all good.
The first thing that you had to do if you're a straight off the street, never flown an airplane type guy, you're going to go to this initial. Do they get a pilot's license out of that, or is it just enough to
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I don't think they get a PPL out of that. I do know they definitely solo when they're there at minimum. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I think they would need. I think it's 40 hours of the FAA
minimum
requirement.
That sounds right.
Yeah. Okay, but you already had it, so you go there to do your phase 1 and learn the fixed wing stuff. And you said it takes about 5 months. You got about 90 hours or so, and then off to beautiful Fort Rucker.
Absolutely,
in the crater of LA, Lower Alabama, which is relatively close to the beaches, so it's not terrible.
Hey, man! After Del Rio, Texas, that was treat.
Yeah, that's true enough. Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny because I think about it going back to Rucker multiple times, and I can't even remember seeing Air Force aircraft. So you guys hide very well. Of course,
we do our best.
Busy eating MREs in a tent apparently
the
entire time. So,
ruck marches.
That's right. Ruck marches every day. We didn't even drive. So okay, so you finish there. You pin on your wings. I mean, what's next? So obviously for you you're going back to what we call Fort Living Room. You're going back home because you're a guard guy or what have you. But for let's say somebody's active duty and they get picked to fly whatever. What happens next? Where do they go?
Sure. So actually, everyone goes to the same schoolhouse once you leave Fort Rucker, depending on what aircraft you're flying. It doesn't matter if you're guard or reserve or active duty. You go to the same schoolhouse. So After Fort Rucker, it was out to Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. It's
Okay.
pretty much in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
And that course was, well, what it's supposed to be and what it ends up being are two different things normally,
Yeah.
due to trying to squeeze people through the pipeline and weather and all that jazz. But that's the HH-60G schoolhouse and will be the 60 Whiskey schoolhouse when that aircraft comes online. So that's where, it goes through the same kind of progression. Here's all your basic stuff. Here's remotes. Here's instrument. And then like, okay, here's how to, tactically employ the aircraft in a basic sense. And there's been back and forth. There's been different syllabi with, okay, well, how advanced do we want to get with these students? In terms of the tactics side of the house, do we want to have the operational units, their home station units, basically top them off with that knowledge, or do we want to try and front load as much as we can? But that's where you get qualified. Both basically and tactically in the 60 is out of Kirtland. And then the only thing that was left for me after that was going up to lovely Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington for lovely 3 weeks of SEER school, Survival Evasion Resistance
Oh, yeah.
Escape. Yeah. That was
Yeah,
fun.
that's always a good time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do that at Rucker as well. I imagine it's a little bit different in Washington, though.
Depends on the year. Depends on time of
Temperature-wise.
year. Yeah.
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 Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so how long, you may have said, how long is the training for the 60?
So it was for me, I started in, I want to say mid-November, and I graduated in early June. So just over 6 months.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's interesting because you kind of touched on a point that we noticed in the last interview talking to Alex, who's a Navy Hawk pilot,
Right.
and a very different mindset, and you kind of touched on it that the Air Force was back and forth about it. In the Army, it's very much like individual skill, you're done.
Yep.
Go to your unit and you're going to learn all that tactical stuff. Whereas it's
Right.
not like in the Navy, you're doing 3 years and you're popping out, but you're a ready to go mission pilot, and everyone expects that from you.
Right.
So I mean, what is kind of the result though? Like
Sure.
you're saying not in November to June, that's 6-7 months.
Right.
What are you coming out as when you show up to your unit? Are you considered mission ready to go, or what?
So almost. And again, this is kind of the back and forth of the syllabus they're having is, do we want to get someone completely full up, or do we want to leave a little bit for the ops units to accomplish? So you come out as a mission qualified co-pilot. Theoretically, you would be able to deploy within a very short amount of time, and there have been guys who have done that. There's a little bit of training at your home unit to get accomplished. Basically some tactical top off training. But you come out, again, I've spoken to some Army guys, so I kind of know what you're referencing. We come out pretty much ready to go with some advanced certifications that are left over. Out at New Mexico, obviously, it's pretty darn hard to get people day and night water operations qualified. There's not really any open water out there for the most part. There are a couple options, but they leave that mostly for the operational units to certify someone, and hey, here's day and night water operations training, how to get people into if they need to, and then out of the water, and a couple other advanced certifications. But for the most part, you're fully tactically qualified.
Yeah. So, I mean, wherever you're based at, there's going to be some special
Sure.
sort of things that are unique to your area, and I imagine, of course, local area orientation type flights and understanding
Absolutely.
where you're
Yep.
at and things like that.
Yep.
But just a deployment standpoint readiness, you guys are basically ready to go. And then I assume it's kind of like the Navy, where over time you've got to build the chops to then be an aircraft commander or a pilot commander. What terminology do you guys use?
Yeah. So the progression for a new pilot coming out of Kirtland is you're a co-pilot first, and then the new pilot progression syllabus that we have, you'll work your way up to basically basic aircraft commander, which is you can be an aircraft commander for anything that's not tactical. So like anything that's not like low level flying, gunnery, things like that. From there, you'll work your way up to a fully qualified mission pilot, which is you can be the aircraft commander for pretty much anything that we do and anything that you're qualified for in terms of special certifications. From there, the next stop would be flight lead, which we normally employ in a flight of 2. Very, very, very seldom is there anything over 2. And then from there, it's instructor pilot and then evaluator pilot. Instructor pilot, you typically will go back out to Kirtland. There have been some instances where people will go out to potentially the weapons school out in Nellis Air Force Base for part of that, which was I was fortunate enough to be able to take part in that. And an evaluator pilot is pretty much, both of those are all these are, at the unit commander discretion, and there's usually training review boards that happen with reviewing someone's hours and performance and what are they certed in, and a decision is made to advance that person, into a position or to hold them back. So,
okay. Well, let's go back to flight school and just kind of review as far as. So we've talked about the training, and these are the things that you're going to do. But what's it like? I mean, what's the culture like?
Sure.
When you're going through that initial fixed wing training, is it pretty intense? Is it you made a comment about some slacking off time or whatever? Like what's a normal day in the life, if you will?
Yeah. So phase 1, the academics. Again, I didn't go out to IFS, so I don't really know quite what things are like out there. I hear they try to mirror the flight line as much as they can to prepare people. But phase 1 is pretty much like, okay, hey, I've got aviation physiology from this time to this time, and then this class from this time to this time. Other than that, your time is yours. At least when I went through it. Phase 2, it gets entirely different. You're on this policy of initially when you show up and for quite a while called your entire class. A class is assigned to a flight. It's called formal release. So you're pretty much pulling 12-hour days, which is the crew duty day for training for a lot of platforms, including the T6. To the point where you pull up into the parking lot outside the squadron, and you're waiting, and you get out of the car, and you go in, and you're waiting to get into the flight room door, and it's like, okay, hack, 12 hours now, boom, go. And everyone's kind of rushing inside. You're trying to get the morning brief set up for the class. You're trying to get everything set up for when the instructor pilots walk in, that someone is up there giving a brief, including, someone from your class is up there giving a brief to include weather, and NOTAMs and things like that. And then they'll usually give you what's called a stand-up emergency procedure. So one of the instructors will walk to the front of the room. They'll verbally describe, some flight conditions and, an indication that you would get. And you'd all be copying this down in your seats. And then they would randomly select someone and say, okay, Lieutenant so-and-so, you have the aircraft. So then you would have to get up to the other side of the table, bring all your checklists with you, and verbally walk through everything that you would do to, get to some sort of a safe conclusion. But it's phase 2 is it's kicking the pants, man. And it's entirely dependent on, I would say, from my experience, on your class and your classmates, as to how successful your class is, and also how much fun you manage to have on the weekends, where it's pretty much like, hey, Monday through Friday you're 100% devoted to what's going on in that training pipeline. And the advice we got from even our instructors was, okay, hey, Friday night let loose, Saturday let loose, and then Sunday halfway through the day, like, hey, it's time to start getting back into the books.
Yeah, that's right, back at it. We had daily questions is what really was the thing. Does that sound like something you guys had as well?
We had those in Rucker.
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And then during T6s, you've got a multitude of things you can be what's called opted for in the syllabus as you get further along. So it's like, well, once I complete this event and this event, like, I could go do a flight, or I could do a simulator, or I could be opted for this like academic class. And so like you kind of need to be ready for all that. So it's a big exercise in kind of like, task management, which is obviously appropriate for aviation. But yeah, T6s is it's no joke, but it can be a lot of fun too. And then my personal experience at phase 3 in Rucker, it's kind of gone back and forth a little bit, but it was a little bit more, they treated you a little bit more like, okay, hey, you know what you're doing.
Sure.
So it was a little bit more of slightly relaxed environment. but not too much, especially during once you start to get into the tactical phases. They're beating you up pretty good in terms of mission planning, and because that's your first introduction to low level and planning for that kind of low altitude environment.
Right.
And then Kirtland, at least for the front enders, for the pilots, as long as you were showing the solid effort and you knew your general knowledge about the systems and the tactics that you could read about, the instructors are more than willing to meet you halfway. They at that point they want to see you succeed, right? They've spent so much time and effort invested into you. Whereas that's one of the first exposures for most of the enlisted crew members, the backenders that we fly with. So for them, Kirtland is a very different experience.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, at some point, there's a switch that's thrown where it's like, okay, we've put a lot of time and money into this guy because helicopters ain't cheap, and training guys
Right.
to fly them is something it's one of the things at Rucker that they changed. Put SEER school in the beginning because they did have so many guys. They spent a year on a guy,
right,
getting him to be a fully qualified Apache pilot, and now he goes to SEER and fails. It's like, well,
oh
okay,
man,
now what?
Yep.
So they put it on the front end and doing it before, which is probably a good idea. But
yeah, I could see that argument.
Yeah. So how big were your classes when you were at Rucker, when you were actually doing the helicopter portion? How big was a class?
Oh, it was relatively small. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Probably 7, maybe 8. And they're all going to castigate me for not exactly remembering, but
yeah, you forgot about me.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's a pretty small class size at Rucker.
So any interesting sort of social events or milestones? Like in the Army, we had the solo cycle.
Right.
Even though it kind of went away, I think it's making its way back. But after you solo, they had this big event with this funky helicopter-looking bicycle, and then of course the Navy you can't go 10 days without having some sort of special event to celebrate something. It seems like in the Navy, but I also know the Air Force is not far off from that. So you guys probably had some sort of special little things here and there.
Yeah, so big events in Air Force pilot training are your initial solo in T6s. So at least when I was going through, you would, your instructor would say like, hey, like you're up for your solo flight. You'd brief with them, you'd brief with the ops supervisor, you go off and do your flight. And then the challenge was to try and evade all your classmates and get back into the flight briefing room without being caught. Which I'm trying to remember in my class. I don't think anyone successfully did that. If you made it back, I believe it was everyone had to buy you drinks or something like that. But if you got caught, which as far as I recall, all of us did, because everyone's out there watching the flight line, watching you and listening to you on your radio and listening for you to goof something up. So you get caught, and then you get thrown into this this big tank of water that the class will paint up with their slogan or logo from the patch that they make up or whatever. And obviously there's some celebrating that night or that weekend. And other major events in Air Force pilot training, track select, like kind of towards the end of T6s, where everyone figures out kind of at least what general mission they're going to. That was a big party, as was drop night, which is pretty much when you get your assignment about a week prior to graduation, I think, at Fort Rucker, where everyone figures out like kind of what aircraft and what base they're going to be assigned to. Those are all pretty big social events during Air Force pilot training.
All right, so you finish up training, you go through SEER, which there's so much that could be talked about with SEER, but then there's also non-disclosures.
Exactly.
So it's just an interesting time, and you've never quite lived until you've gone through it.
But, I describe it as it's the best training that I never want to go through again.
Well, I think that's great because I did not enjoy it, but I look back on it very fondly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which it also helps that I went, like you said, in a very good time of year. I think I went like in a May, April time frame, and the weather was perfect. But you do learn a lot of interesting things, and it is a lot of fun in retrospect. But at the time, and any Army course where they let you grow a beard and encourage you to kind of relax a little bit is a good thing. But it was the one time that I was living outdoors in Fort Rucker. So
there you go.
So much for the tent. So much for the tent thing. But Okay, so but you finish all that training and now you go back to your unit. So tell us, what is it like being a brand new, what we would call a line pilot in the Army,
Sure.
but a mission pilot, whatever term you guys use. But you show up to your unit, you're freshly minted pilot. What's that like?
Yeah, so you certainly feel like, everything that you do, or at least I felt, that everything that I was doing was being watched. By not only my peers, on the front end of the aircraft, not only the pilots, my fellow co-pilots, and on up the instructor and squadron commander, but also by our enlisted crew members, which were, we have a very tight relationship with those guys, in the Air Force community. We all kind of fly and operate together, and we're all part of the same crew. They're responsible for a lot of things that other service branches, their enlisted crew members might not be responsible for. They pre-flight the helicopter. They're responsible primarily for reading off the checklists. They do a lot of system analysis with us. They'll operate the hoist, the weapon systems on the aircraft. So they're, among other things. So they're, when you have a senior enlisted crew member, on a flight with you, or just watching how you do things around the squadron, it's at least I felt, some pressure, but that's not a bad thing all the time.
No.
Yeah, so you have, when you go back, at least on the guard side, now they've upped it where you can get up to a year's worth of orders, which is a great thing. When I went through, it was only 90 days worth, where you were active duty the entire time out at the base. So during that time, like you're expected, hey, you're flying as much as you can. You're getting those additional certifications that they weren't able to get you out of Kirtland. They're basically topping you off to be ready to go off to deploy. If we need to, or respond to something within the United States for disaster relief or something. But if you're not flying, like, hey, you should be in the books, you should be studying, you should be in the intel vault, looking at all the classified documents and on, SIPRnet, or the classified internet, basically, for those who aren't familiar with that, or JWICS if your squadron has that. So yeah, there's certainly a good deal of pressure, which is, like I said, it's not a bad thing, when you're back in the squadron for the first time.
So you're saying that in the guard, at least air guard, that they are putting you on active guard orders so that you can essentially get good. You're
Yeah,
you're training and
yeah,
flying and doing all that stuff, and not
yep,
having to worry about, well, I'm also a whatever,
exactly,
bartender or something.
right, yeah,
Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
a pretty good idea, because yeah, I mean, those are formative, months and years right there in those early days, and everything that
absolutely,
you learn and get codified at that time is going to stick with you for the rest of your career. So no,
yeah.
that's interesting. I didn't know that. So you're a mission pilot for a while, or a co-pilot, and then, like we kind of talked about earlier, at some point, based on, I'm sure it's true across the board in all the branches. It's really based on not so much time, but maturity, right? And your
Sure.
decision making
Yep.
process, and how you obviously control the aircraft, but also control of the crew,
Yep.
control of another aircraft, and they're sort of nurturing that as you go, and eventually you'll be made a what did you say? We call it a pilot in command. What did you guys call it?
Yeah. So we'll go first. We'll make someone I forget what the terminology is now, but basically a basic aircraft commander, basic
Okay.
aircraft qualified.
Right.
So they can do everything that's non-tactical, and then mission pilot, which is everything tactical, flight lead, and then instructor evaluator.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. And so for the unit that you're in, that is a combat search and rescue unit, or how is that designated?
Yeah, so we're the 101st Rescue Squadron, and so the way the Air Force kind of structures the 60G community is that we're dedicated personnel recovery. Now, without going too far into the weeds, personnel recovery can mean anything from a non-combatant evacuation operation, pulling out an embassy, which is mainly something that the Marines do, that they're best equipped for in most cases, all the way up to kind of the higher end of things that we train for, combat search and rescue, someone isolated, behind the front line of combat in a, conventional full blown scenario, or, even hostage rescue, CASEVAC, there's all kinds of things along that spectrum. Um, but our primary mission is combat search and rescue. But anything else, personnel recovery, is certainly something we could be tasked to do overseas. And then stateside, we've obviously done a fair amount of search and rescue. Possibly not as much as we would have liked to do because guys are always chomping at the bit, but we've certainly gotten more into it since 2017.
So, do you guys? I mean, I'm assuming there's Coast Guard up where you're at. Do you guys work with them at all, or is it just kind of you guys are kind of doing your own thing? Or?
Yeah, so the nearest Coast Guard air station, we're kind of smack in the middle between two, probably slightly closer to Cape Cod, where they've got MH-60s out of there, and then they've got 65s out of Atlantic City. So, the Coast Guard is the primary, search and rescue response force especially for anything in maritime, which is understandable. We've done a couple exercises with them. I'd obviously like to work, more with them, and we've certainly picked up some work, especially for flying around the local area. One of my techniques is always to keep listening on Marine Channel 16, which is the international hail and distress frequency. And if we hear something going on, we'll certainly offer up our help, if we're able to do so. We've gotten a couple of assignments that way. But certainly the Coast Guard is the primary.
And then for the Air Force, are all the, other than when you get into kind of special operations, but are all the helicopter squadrons, are they all essentially the same thing, combat search and rescue, or is there other types?
The 60 community, 60G community, which will be the 60 whiskey community. Yes, that's all kind of the same mission focus right there. What's currently the UH-1N and will be the MH-139. Their squadrons have a couple different jobs, depending on where they're at. There's a number that are located, let's see, Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. They're primarily ICBM missile field support in terms of getting crews out there, security force response teams, escorting convoys, that kind of thing. And then they do some civil SAR on the side. There's a unit that supports the SEER school out in Washington primarily. And then there are two units. There's one in Japan and one in Andrews that do DV support and a couple other missions.
Alrighty, well, that's a good rundown. I want to take a look at a couple of these questions that we got from listeners. I'd let everyone know that I was going to be talking to you and kind of asked, what are some things people want to ask, and I sent these to you. But it looks like we've covered a lot of them. One of the big questions was kind of what you were just talking about. Any changes coming to CSAR airframe and equipment? So you were talking about going from the 60 Gulf to the 60 Whiskey. What fundamentally is different?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mention that because my full-time job since 2015 is I've actually been working with Sikorsky. That's my full-time job on the 60 Whiskey program. Okay. So yeah, major things are difference between the 60G and the 60 Whiskey. If I was to put it in a nutshell, I think the defense systems are a big leap. I think the situational awareness that the crew will have in terms of data link is quite a big thing.
So you mean like Link 16?
Yeah, right. So right now, and this will probably lead into a question that I saw you've got later on. But one of the things we've got on the G right now is SADL, situational awareness data link. Right. So we've got that right now, but we'll be going to Link 16 for stateside flying. We'll finally be able to do GPS IFR. Thank goodness. And the flight director up front, is fully coupled, so that's going to be a big thing as well for guys up front to learn. So yeah, I could go on and on about the whiskey. I don't want to tread too deeply into it because of my Sikorsky gig, but I certainly think it's going to be it's going to be a good aircraft. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, but fundamentally, it's increasing situational awareness, as you and I both know, is probably one of the more important things than anything else. I mean, you can teach a monkey to wiggle the sticks and fly a helicopter, but the ability to understand what's going on and anything that can augment that is welcome.
And one of the big things too that just kind of popped into my head is right now in the G we've got we can put into the cabin, I should say, internal auxiliary fuel tanks to kind of extend our range and duration as well as helicopter air refueling. In the Whiskey, because there's obviously plumbing or tubing that runs from those tanks to the main tanks, and the transfer system needs to work correctly, which usually does, if not automatically, then manually, to get fuel from the auxiliary tanks to the main tanks. In the Whiskey, you're not going to have any of those problems. You'll have basically two main fuel tanks That'll give you not quite as much as the maximum amount we can carry right now, but a pretty darn good compromise on that without having to worry about all those transfer problems in cabin space and so on and so forth.
Do you guys carry wing stores like ox tanks on the wings like we do in the Army 60s?
No, we don't. I'm pretty sure the wiring is on the aircraft for the ESSS, but we don't utilize it. All of our fuel is either in the mains or so there's a few different options for fuel in the cabin or in the aux tanks. The most we can carry is dual 185 gallon tanks, which will give us about 4,700 pounds of gas. And then there is the option for a single 200 gallon tank, which will give us 3,600. And then you can go with the single 185, which will give you around just over 3,400, I believe. And then obviously that's extended by air refueling if you've got the assets in theater or FARP. But no, we don't carry anything out of the ESSS system. No.
And I'll probably be attacked if I don't ask you this question, because you bring up the air refueling capability, but where is that trained at? At what phase do you learn how to do that? Is that within the flight school, or is that once you get to your unit?
That's normally at Kirtland. Yeah. Out in New Mexico is where you get that. We had some guys for a while. There was some tanker availability issues, some air refueling probe issues that we did that training at home station. But for the vast majority of people, that's out of Kirtland in New Mexico.
Okay. And is that a annual or semi-annual requirement that you got to do so many refuels, or how does that work?
Right now, the currency for it, and this changes. It's changed a few times since I've been in the community, but right now it's 180 days, essentially 6 months is the currency for air refueling. Now, does that equal proficiency? Like you're necessarily good at it, especially when you're new? Absolutely not. But that's the currency for it.
No is the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
How many do you have to do? Just one every 180 days, or?
No. So there's minimum requirements that are spelled out for each training event we've got. So you need to have, for pilots, it's at least one contact or hit, as we call them, each side, left hose and right hose, as well as crossing over the tanker.
Let's take a look at some of these other questions. Two of these kind of blur together. Airframe use and training and changes occur. You talked about that already at Rucker. They're kind of switching things out. And then a comparison between Navy and Air Force CSAR equipment mission type. I don't know that the Navy looks at it as a dedicated mission the way the Air Force does. I don't know if I'm right on that.
That's not a bad way to put it. Hopefully not offending too many Navy folks out there. But we've got people from all different walks of life in our squadron. But we do have a prior Navy guy who was a 60 Romeo guy, so in the Navy, to my understanding, 60 Romeo and 60 Sierra, they're kind of two different worlds in and of themselves, or they have two different focuses or foci. I don't know if that's even a word.
Yes.
Anyway,
the plural of focus. Yeah.
So yeah, I think the key difference when it comes to CSAR personnel recovery between us and the Navy is kind of the way you put it. The Air Force looks at us as kind of a dedicated personnel recovery asset or personnel recovery force. As well as the HC-130 and the PJ rescue squadrons. It's kind of like the rescue triad, as they call it. But yeah, the Navy, and really through no fault of their own, they're good guys. I've trained with them. We've gotten to get down to Key West. I know, difficult TDY, to work with them. Yeah, to work with the Sierra Squadron, who was getting ready to go overseas. To just kind of, hey, here's how we kind of think of CSAR or PR, and fly with them. But they've got so many other mission sets. They've got anything basic from vertical replenishment, from ship to ship, to sitting the SAR alert off of a carrier, which is obviously boring and mundane, but important stuff if somebody punches out, to all the way to naval special warfare support. So they've got a lot of things on their plate. Whereas this is something that this is our focus. This is what we do day in and day out. So.
Yeah, I was surprised. I guess I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised talking to my last guest when he was, just like you said, the Romeo and the Sierra, the differences, because he flew both and was both units, and was talking about all the tactical training and the weapons employment, shooting torpedoes and Hellfires and dropping mines and sonar buoys and stuff. And I'd never really I knew it, but I never really thought about it. But you're right; they're trying to wear a lot of hats with that airframe, and the Air Force, just kind of doesn't need to do that. You're not doing air assaults, and you're not shooting torpedoes at people. So what do you need helicopters for? But personnel recovery is a huge one, and all I think aviators across all the services definitely recognize the value of having a force that's dedicated and capable of doing that, because that's probably who's going to come get you if things go bad and you're downtown. So
yeah, it's interesting to bring up the Navy weapons employment. We've got the one guy in our squadron who he went to the Navy weapons instructor course, and so we're in the 60G we can have miniguns or 50 cal on the aircraft, and that can be either forward fire or flex fire out the side of the aircraft. So we're fairly familiar with gunnery patterns and call for fire, 5-line rotor wing casts, all that stuff. That's something that we train to all the time. But we were out working with a Navy Special Warfare team. I think it was out in Kentucky. I wasn't on the trip, but I heard the story relayed to me. And the team on the ground asked just to practice some hellfire shots. We're kind of like, what are you talking about? And this guy, he just apparently went like full Rain Man and just kind of like took control of the, like laser on, like rifle, time of flight 1 minute. Everyone's like, Bill, what are you even saying? But
yeah,
it's funny you bring that up because
he watched Firebirds and just
exactly.
Oh Lord. Okay. Well, no, that sounds good. And I think that was all the questions that people had about it. And I think it would be interesting to delve into the combat search and rescue stuff, as a dedicated topic. But I think we've kind of hit all the highlights on flight school, and that's really what we wanted to do for this series. And then we'll kind of roll into some other topics. So yeah, I'd like to definitely have you back another time, and maybe someone else that's worked there in your unit, or other people that you've worked with, and just kind of expand the network of knowledge. And really that's what we're trying to do here, is just kind of gather these stories and educate people who, they don't really understand a lot of times what we do. And, I was actually talking to my dad yesterday about the show and kind of revealing some things to him about, things that he just never knew. He grew up around aircraft, and I didn't know helicopters did that. So, in fact, I'll never forget my mom visiting during, when I was in flight school. You guys probably had some sort of family day, I assume.
Oh yeah, sure, yep.
Yeah, and the parents came up, and I remember, getting out of the aircraft, and my stick buddy jumped in to fly, and my mom says, they don't land the way I thought they'd land. Well, what do you mean? Well, in the movies, they always seem to just come straight down and land. Like, no, it doesn't really work that way. But no, I appreciate you taking the time and kind of clearing things up for us as far as trying to understand how the Air Force does things, and the pathway that other people might be interested in pursuing, and kind of understand what's in store for them. And it sounds exciting. I think the Air Force and the Navy guys get a little bit more fun than the Army guys, because you get to do some fixed wing stuff. But but like I said, in the last one too, we talked about this. I think it's, there's good and bad to both sides, and
definitely
how you do things, and the end result is all that matters. And I think the end result is everybody's getting after it. So
definitely.
But thanks for coming on and spending some time with me here on a Monday night.
Yeah, no problem, Brian. Thanks for the invite again.
So Luke, are you jealous that we never got to do any air-to-air refuel?
A little bit. I would have always have advocated for refueling boom on a 58D. It was one of our more difficult obstacles to bypass.
Yeah, it had to be a really tiny hose. Otherwise, we'd have been tipped over the whole time.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, any other thoughts from listening to that?
Yeah, so I like that their approach to it. It seemed like it built in intensity. So you talked about the beginning part where he was, a little more laid back. Granted, he got to kind of clip out of some of that with having some fixed wing civilian time. That was a big help. But it's just neat to see the different forces. One, the recruiting model to get pilots in. That Air National Guard path he spelled out that's attainable for people. And it really just takes finding somebody to ask the questions to get in contact with them. And it's kind of sad that more people don't know about it, because I think there's a lot of people that would really appreciate that opportunity. You got to know it's there.
Yeah, I actually had a guy that worked for me this past year, he decided he was going to get out of active duty, and I pointed him at the Air Guard, and I said, look, that it seems like a really good deal. I don't remember if it was an interview or not, but I was talking to Sean about, it's interesting when you look at the Army Guard, and you typically think of older equipment. And then you talk about the Air Guard, and these guys have F-35s and, brand new whiskey model 60s and things. So it's a different force than, I think that we default think to when we think of the Guard. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. So yeah, no, I agree. I think that's an interesting way that they kind of, it's almost like applying for a job at a particular unit. And of course, being in the Guard, you're going to stay at that same unit for quite a while. So you're going to build a lot of good relationships.
So there's some pros and cons being in the National Guard with people being on station for a long time. They're all either part of the state or commute there or were at one time in the state. And you get some really good continuity. Sometimes there's some second and third order political effects because the Guards kind of operates like a family for the most part. And on assessment visits, we got to see some of the best maintained facilities and well-run programs. But sometimes there was the full other extreme. There wasn't much middle ground. So the Guard units were usually really super squared away, had their stuff locked down tight, had fantastic facilities. Obviously, for a lot of their stuff is funded by the state. But of course there were a few outliers there that weren't as well prepared or well monitored and run.
Yeah, no, that's true. Okay. Well, listen, I appreciate you taking the time to help me out with this episode, and I enjoyed the talk, and I am a little jealous of these other branches. They get a little fixed wing time. I guess I'm disappointed on their behalf, though. They don't seem to get any licensing out of it, but I imagine that transfers over pretty easily if they do want to get their license later. But it sounds like a good time and pretty intense. I was actually kind of surprised the way that he described the Air Force one. It seemed a little bit more intense than I expected it to be. I figured they were going to have, half days all the time and, catered lunches and things. But they also thought that we were going to be living in tents. So we
right.
all panned out.
It probably balances out somewhere in the middle.
All right, well, I think that wraps it up for this week's episode. Again, episode 7. I'm pretty proud that we've even made it this far. So thanks for everyone coming along on the journey. And as always, the views expressed by the guests and host are their own, do not represent the Department of Defense or any private business. Appreciate you guys listening, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.